Good morning, everyone. Today we have come to the end of the liturgical year where we celebrate the solemnity of Christ the King. Today serves as a yearly reminder that Christ must reign not just in heaven, but over all of creation. And most importantly, he must reign in our minds, in our wills, and in our hearts. In our minds so that we can think like Christ, in our wills so that we can act like Christ, and in our hearts so that we can love like Christ. This feast is not just a reminder for the faithful, but when it was established in 1925, it was also a reminder to the totalitarian governments of the time that only Jesus Christ is the true sovereign King. Last year, if you were at any of my masses, I recounted the story of St. Thomas More, who for the love of Christ died at the hand of King Henry VIII, another totalitarian regime. And so this year I want to bring it a little closer to home and tell you the story of little Jose Luis, who fought against the anti-Christian, anti-Catholic, totalitarian government down in Mexico in the 1920s, and who died at the age of 14, just 2 short years after this solemnity was first introduced to the church. In 1917, the Mexican Constitution sparked a terrible conflict. It put the church under the strict control of the state. It regulated Catholic preaching, allotted a fixed number of priests per state, dictated mass attendance, baptisms, weddings, the sacraments, tithing. Even the ringing of church bells was hampered, and clergy caught disobeying these unjust laws were either exiled or killed. Within 3 years of the Constitution being introduced, the laws began to be enforced brutally, with hundreds of priests being exiled. And by 1926, the public practice of the faith was entirely outlawed. All the education, all the Catholic schools were removed from the care of the church and put under direct control of the state. Religious vows were made illegal. Monasteries and convents were dissolved. Religious could no longer wear habits, and all church property was confiscated. This persecution has direct ties to here in Southern California, especially with the sisters, the Carmelite sisters in Alhambra. Their particular reason for being here in Alhambra, in our very backyard, is because they were being persecuted in Mexico. So their entire community had to flee for their lives, for safety, so that they could continue ministering to the people of God, and so that they could live as a community and their charism could flourish. So they escaped the persecution down in Mexico and came here to Alhambra. During this time of persecution down there was a strong reaction that began to ferment among the faithful. They banded together and began what is now known as the Cristero movement. And among these Catholics, we find the heroic story of little Jose Luis Sanchez del Rio. Little Jose Luis saw the horrific persecution of the church, and following in the footsteps of his older brothers, asked for his parents' blessing to join the movement. Now, at the time, like any good parents, like, absolutely not. You're only 14 years old. But he was persistent, and his parents finally relented and gave him their blessing. And at this, little Jose was overjoyed, but also very aware of the suffering he would endure. And before departing, he told his parents that for Jesus Christ, I will do everything. And he set off at once to the nearest Cristero camp and presented himself to the officer in charge. And because the officer in charge also thought he was a little young, it's like, no, you can't be on the front line, you can't be doing any of this stuff, they gave him very basic tasks, like serving food, carrying water, preparing fires, feeding the horses, very simple things to try and keep him out of the way and out of trouble and safe. Now, I don't know if any of you know any 14-year-old males, but usually when there's like stuff about war or like heroics involved, they're all gung-ho about it, like, oh, absolutely, let me sign up right now, let me go, this is exciting, I want to be there. So I can only imagine how frustrated little Jose would have been at not being able to do anything other than feed some horses and some people. But despite this, He enthusiastically went about his chores, remembering what he had told his parents as he left. I will do everything for Jesus Christ. And so he went enthusiastically about his chores, and the soldiers quickly became fond of him because he would go around and he would cheer them up. He would bring them excitement and joy that only youth can bring. And so he also began joining them for daily mass and daily rosary in the evenings, all the soldiers. And so finally one of them taught him how to play the bugle and how to do some more military-esque type of things and duties. Until finally he learned the bugle and was assigned as the standard bearer to one of the generals in the Cristeros movement. Again, this assignment was meant to try and keep him out of harm's way, because you're not carrying a gun, you're not doing anything, you just got to carry a flag around for a while. But if you don't know what a standard bearer is in the military, you're carrying a flag, but that flag has to stay right next to the officer. It's the unit insignia. It's meant to identify where the leader is, so that all your soldiers, when that flag starts going and doing whatever, they're going to follow the flag, because it's really hard to follow when there's hundreds and thousands of people around. So you follow the flag. And so one of the days that he was out with the general, they went on an ambush against the Federales. And while they were there, as they were doing the ambush, little Jose noticed that the general's horse dropped from underneath him, and so the general was on the ground. So little Jose runs up on his horse, trots up, I guess, on his horse to the general, says, "General, here, take my horse and get out of here, like, you need to go." The general, wanting to protect the boy, said, "No, boy, you run, you flee, get out of here." But Jose Luis wouldn't move. He said, "No, you're the general, you're important. You need to lead these men, you need to win this fight." And so the general, and then he said, "Viva Cristo Rey," and at that the general's like, dang it, okay. So the general, recognizing the sacrifice of the boy, hops up on the horse and starts to retreat. Little Jose Luis stays there and fights to try and provide any means of escape for anyone else to get away, for his brothers and the soldiers to leave. And then he's finally captured. What's interesting about his capture is that he's eventually taken to the church of his baptism, the same church he was baptized in as a little boy. Now, because the government had seized all the properties of the churches, all the church property, including the church themselves, this particular church anyways, was used as both a prison and as a corral, a place for livestock. And so they had set up, the soldiers had, because it's what soldiers do, they set up in the sanctuary a fighting ring for the roosters, so that it would desecrate the altar and the area and make a mockery of God. And so the roosters were all over the sanctuary. They were on the tabernacle, they were on the crucifix, the beautiful artwork, everything. And little Jose saw this, and he was appalled. But because he was in the same place with them, because they were effectively both prisoners in this area, in the church, he waited until nightfall. And he knew what he had to do, but he also knew what kind of trouble he would get in. He knew the consequences of his actions. So one night during his captivity, he goes and he cracks the necks of the chickens. And then he sits down in prayer, and then eventually goes to bed. And the next morning, in retaliation, little Jose is sentenced to death. His captors took him, and they weren't trying to be very friendly, but in fact, quite the opposite. What they did was they took the soles of his feet and cut them. And they made him walk 10 blocks to the nearest cemetery. When he got there, there was a little levity in him, and he kept joking with his captors and making fun of them. And so he said, "Oh, which one's mine? Have you already plotted out for me?" In a very joking way. Every slice of the foot, every beating that he took, every step that he took towards that cemetery, he yelled, "Viva Cristo Rey!" Long live Christ the King. Before he was shot, he had told the soldiers and the officer that were there for the execution, that he was always going to be a follower of Christ, that he was always going to say "Viva Cristo Rey," and even if his foot was twitching and he couldn't speak, that meant "Viva Cristo Rey." And so his last words on earth were "Viva Cristo Rey," long live Christ the King. And Jose Luis Sanchez del Rio won the crown of martyrdom that day and was canonized a saint by the church in 2016. My brothers and sisters, Christ must be the King of our lives, of every aspect of it. When we stand up for the faith like little Jose Luis, it must be for Christ our King. When we feed the hungry, it must be for Christ our King. When we clothe the naked, it must be for Christ our King. When we visit the sick and the imprisoned, it must be for Christ our King. All for Christ, all for our King. Viva Cristo Rey.